The wrong text message can change your life faster than you think. It was raining, the kind of steady late-night rain that turns every streetlight into a blurry halo outside my apartment window in Brooklyn. I was sitting cross-legged on the couch in my tiny 500-square-foot studio, my phone glowing in the dark while a half-empty takeout container of lo mein cooled on the coffee table. Midnight was creeping closer, and the city outside had settled into that strange quiet New York sometimes gets after 11, when even the traffic sounds tired. My thumb hovered over the screen as I stared at the message thread with Alex. My ex. Or maybe still my boyfriend. I honestly didn't know anymore. The argument earlier that night had been stupid. The kind of argument couples have when they're both exhausted and neither one wants to be the first to apologize. I had walked out of the restaurant before dessert arrived. He hadn't followed. Pride is a funny thing. It feels powerful in the moment and lonely 5 hours later. I sighed and typed the message again, deleting it twice before finally letting it stay. I didn't mean to embarrass you tonight. Can we talk? Simple. Honest. My finger hesitated over the send button like it weighed 50 pounds. Then I pressed it. The message flew away into the digital void, and I tossed my phone onto the couch beside me. There. Done. I leaned back and listened to the rain tapping against the glass. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. My phone buzzed. I grabbed it immediately, my stomach twisting with that nervous mix of hope and regret. But the message on the screen wasn't what I expected. Unknown number. Who is this? I frowned. That was weird. Alex always saved my number. I scrolled up. My stomach dropped. The contact at the top of the thread wasn't Alex. It wasn't anyone I knew. Just a random string of numbers I must have clicked earlier without noticing. My cheeks warmed with embarrassment even though I was completely alone. Great. Emily, I muttered to myself. Now some stranger thinks you're begging for attention. I started typing an apology. Sorry, wrong number. But before I could send it, another message appeared. You contacted me first. My eyebrows pulled together. The tone was strange. Not rude exactly. Just cold. Like whoever wrote it wasn't used to explaining themselves. I tried to lighten the mood. Sorry about that. I meant to text someone else. Ignore it. 3 dots appeared on the screen, blinking as the other person typed. Then they disappeared. Then they appeared again. Whoever it was seemed to be thinking carefully about what to say. Finally the message came through. That may not be possible. I stared at the words. What does that even mean? I typed back before I could stop myself. Pretty sure it is. Wrong number happens all the time. Another pause. Longer this time. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming softly against the fire escape outside my window. Somewhere down the street a car door slammed. The city breathed in that slow midnight rhythm I'd lived with my entire life. My phone buzzed again. Where are you? I blinked at the screen. Okay, that was definitely weird. I laughed quietly to myself and shook my head. I'm not answering that. It's just a wrong text. I placed the phone back on the couch and stood up to rinse my takeout container in the sink. The faucet sputtered to life with that familiar rattle my landlord still hadn't fixed. Water splashed against the metal basin as I scrubbed absent-mindedly, trying not to think about Alex or the awkward message I'd just sent to a stranger. But my mind kept drifting back to the conversation. Something about it felt off. Not threatening. Just unusual. Like the person on the other side of the phone lived in a completely different world from mine. My phone buzzed again behind me on the couch. I ignored it. Then it buzzed a second time. And a third. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel before walking back into the living room. The screen glowed against the dark fabric cushions. 3 new messages waited for me. The first one read, "You shouldn't have sent that text." The second, "Now I need to understand why you did." My stomach tightened slightly as I read the third message. "Because whoever you are, you just reached a number that almost no one in this city has." I stared at the screen, unsure whether to laugh or feel uneasy. Then outside my window, headlights suddenly flooded the street with bright white light. The light outside my window did not look like normal traffic. At first I told myself it was just a delivery truck turning around or someone pulling into the curb. Brooklyn streets are full of headlights at night. But these lights did not move. They grew brighter, wider, like several cars had stopped at once. I walked slowly toward the window, my phone still in my hand, the stranger's last message glowing on the screen. "Because whoever you are, you just reached a number that almost no one in this city has." The rain streaked across the glass, turning everything outside into distorted shapes of white and yellow light. I pushed the curtain aside with 2 fingers and leaned closer to the window. That was when my stomach tightened. 3 black SUVs were parked along the curb in front of my building. Not ordinary cars. They were large, polished, the kind of vehicles you usually see outside expensive hotels in Manhattan or government buildings in Washington. Their headlights were on, cutting through the rain like spotlights. For a moment I just stared, confused. My building was a quiet 4-story walk-up with chipped brick and a crooked fire escape. The most exciting thing that usually happened on this block was when Mrs. Donnelly from apartment 2B yelled at teenagers for sitting on the stoop. Nothing about this place required 3 identical black SUVs. My phone buzzed again in my hand. I looked down automatically. Are you alone? The message appeared under the others. My heart skipped a beat. That question felt personal in a way the earlier messages had not. I looked back out the window. One of the SUV doors opened. A tall figure stepped out into the rain holding an umbrella. Another door opened on a different vehicle. Then another. I counted quickly. 1, 2, 3. 4 men now stood on the sidewalk, all wearing dark coats that looked almost identical in the streetlight glow. They did not rush. They did not shout. They simply looked up at the building. My building. I felt a sudden wave of nervous laughter bubble in my chest. This cannot be connected. There is no way this has anything to do with a wrong text message. That is ridiculous. I typed quickly with my thumb. Yes. Why? The reply came almost instantly. Good. Stay where you are. I frowned at the screen. That was when another car turned the corner slowly and joined the others. A 4th SUV rolled to a stop behind the line already waiting outside my building. Its headlights illuminated the rain-soaked pavement and the row of bicycles chained to the street sign near the corner deli. My pulse quickened. This was starting to feel very strange. I checked the number again at the top of the message thread, as if that might somehow explain what was happening outside. It was still just a random phone number. No name. No contact photo. Nothing. I typed another message before I could overthink it. Look, whoever this is, I think you have the wrong idea. I sent a message by mistake earlier. That is all. For several seconds, there was no response. Outside, 2 more men stepped out of one of the SUVs. One of them glanced down at something in his hand, probably a phone. The other adjusted his coat and scanned the building entrance like he was memorizing every detail. My chest tightened. They were definitely looking at my building. My phone buzzed again. The message appeared slowly, like each word had been chosen with care. I do not make mistakes about things like this. I stared at the screen. My apartment suddenly felt smaller. The walls closer. The hum of the refrigerator in the corner sounded louder than it had a minute ago. Another message appeared. Apartment 4C. Emily Carter. 24 years old. I stopped breathing. My name. My exact apartment number. I looked toward the door automatically, as if someone might already be standing on the other side of it. My hands felt colder now as I typed. Who are you? The typing dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Outside, the rain continued falling steadily while the line of black SUVs idled silently along the curb. Finally, the message arrived. The answer is easier to show than to explain. A second later, the buzzer at the front door of my building rang. The buzzer sound echoed through the apartment like a sudden alarm. It was loud, sharp, the kind of sound that instantly makes your heart jump because you know someone downstairs is pressing the button connected directly to your door. I froze in the middle of the living room, staring at my phone while the rain continued tapping softly against the window behind me. For a moment I hoped it was just a coincidence. Maybe a delivery driver. Maybe someone visiting another apartment who pressed the wrong button. But deep down I already knew that was not true. My phone buzzed again. You should answer that. My throat felt dry as I read the message. The buzzing sound downstairs came again, longer this time. Whoever was pressing it clearly had no intention of leaving. I walked slowly toward the small intercom mounted beside my front door. The metal speaker looked suddenly unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else's apartment instead of mine. Outside, faint through the wall, I could hear the quiet hum of engines still idling on the street below. For black SUVs. Maybe more now. I swallowed and pressed the small talk button. Hello? My voice sounded thinner than I expected. For 2 seconds, there was only the faint crackle of the speaker. Then a calm male voice answered. Miss Carter. The way he said my name made my spine straighten immediately. Not a question. Not uncertain. Certain. Polite. Controlled. Yes? I said cautiously. The man paused briefly, like he was choosing his next words carefully. Someone would like to speak with you. The rain outside grew heavier, rattling softly against the fire escape outside my window. I gripped the edge of the intercom box. I think you have the wrong apartment, I said. Another pause. Then the voice replied, still calm, still polite. We do not make mistakes about things like this. I glanced at my phone again. The message thread was still open, the last message staring back at me like it was watching the entire situation unfold in real time. Apartment 4C, Emily Carter, 24 years old. I felt a small knot tighten in my stomach. The voice downstairs spoke again. Would you mind coming to the entrance for a moment? It will only take a minute. I looked toward my apartment door automatically. The hallway beyond it was quiet, just the dim yellow light that always flickered above the stairs after midnight. Nothing looked different. Nothing looked dangerous. And yet everything suddenly felt different. My phone buzzed again in my hand. I did not tell them to come upstairs. My heart beat faster when I read the message. The next one appeared almost instantly. That means they are being respectful. Respectful. I almost laughed out loud at the word. There were 4 black SUVs parked outside my building, and strangers who knew. My full name asking me to come downstairs in the middle of the night. Respectful was not exactly the word that came to mind. I typed quickly, "Are those your people outside?" 3 small dots appeared on the screen again. Then the reply came. Yes. I stared at the message. Then another line appeared under it. I prefer to handle misunderstandings personally. My mind raced through possibilities that did not make any sense. Who exactly was this person? Why would a simple wrong number turn into this? I looked back toward the window and pulled the curtain aside again. The rain blurred the streetlights, but the vehicles were still clearly visible. One of the men stood beside the building entrance holding an umbrella while another checked something on a phone that glowed faintly in the dark. None of them looked impatient. None of them were rushing. They simply waited. Like they already knew how this was going to end. My phone buzzed again. You can come downstairs now, Emily. The message appeared followed by another one almost immediately. Or I can come up. I stared at those last 4 words for several seconds. My apartment suddenly felt very small again. I slowly slipped my phone into my jacket pocket and walked toward the door. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment before turning it. The hallway outside smelled faintly like old carpet and someone cooking pasta 3 floors below. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes ago. Except now my heartbeat was louder than the hum of the building lights. I stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind me. Then I walked toward the stairs leading down to the front entrance where someone was waiting to meet the woman who had accidentally sent a message to the wrong number. I have learned that the quietest moments in life are sometimes the ones that change everything. The stairwell of my building creaked softly under my steps as I moved downward, 1 floor at a time. The lights above the stairs flickered the way they always did after midnight, buzzing faintly like tired insects. Normally, I never noticed that sound. Tonight it seemed unusually loud. My hand slid along the cold metal railing while my mind replayed the messages from the stranger again and again. Apartment 4C, Emily Carter, 24 years old. The words felt heavier now that I was actually walking toward the people who had sent them. By the time I reached the 2nd floor, my heart was beating faster than the rain tapping against the windows in the hallway. I paused for a moment, listening. The building was quiet. Mrs. Donnelly's television from apartment 2B was finally off. Somewhere above me a pipe clanked softly as the heat system shifted. Otherwise there was only silence. And beneath that silence, faint but unmistakable, the low steady hum of engines waiting outside. I continued down the stairs. The closer I got to the entrance, the brighter the light became from the glass door at the front of the building. The street lamps and SUV headlights poured through the rain-covered glass, casting long reflections across the worn tile floor of the lobby. I stopped halfway down the final set of steps and looked through the door. The scene outside felt surreal. For large black SUVs lined the curb like a small motorcade. Their headlights reflected off the wet pavement and the puddles along the sidewalk. Rain fell steadily, blurring the shapes of the surrounding buildings and turning the streetlights into glowing circles in the night. Several men stood outside near the entrance. All of them wore dark coats that looked expensive even from across the lobby. One of them held an umbrella near the door, while another spoke quietly into a phone. None of them looked impatient. None of them looked nervous. They simply stood there with the calm posture of people who were used to waiting exactly as long as necessary. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. I pulled it out slowly. You made the right choice. I stared at the message for a moment. Then another one appeared beneath it. I am outside. I lifted my eyes toward the street again, trying to guess which one of the men might be the person behind the messages. The man holding the umbrella stood closest to the entrance. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or a little taller, with dark hair neatly combed back and a long black coat that looked tailored instead of store-bought. Even through the rain and the glass door, I could tell he carried himself differently from the others. Not more aggressive, not louder, just still, like the center of gravity in the middle of the entire scene. I realized suddenly that the other men were positioned around him without making it obvious. They stood slightly behind him or several steps away, leaving a quiet circle of space around the umbrella. My chest tightened as the thought formed in my mind. That must be him. My phone buzzed again. The door is unlocked. I glanced down at the handle of the entrance door. It was true. Someone must have buzzed it open earlier because the latch was slightly loose instead of fully locked like it usually was at night. My hand hesitated in the air for a second before pushing the door open. The rain sounded louder immediately, filling the space between the buildings with its steady whisper. Cool air brushed against my face as I stepped onto the small concrete landing outside the entrance. The man with the umbrella turned toward me the moment the door opened. Up close he looked a little older than I expected. Early 30s maybe. His suit underneath the coat was dark and perfectly fitted, the kind of clothing that looked effortless but was probably very expensive. His expression was calm, almost thoughtful, as if he had been expecting this exact moment for several minutes already. He lowered the phone in his hand and slipped it into his coat pocket. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Rain tapped against the umbrella above him, while the headlights behind the SUVs illuminated the misty air. Finally, he took one slow step forward and looked directly at me. "Miss Carter," he said quietly. His voice was exactly the same calm voice that had answered the intercom earlier. I swallowed and nodded once. "Yes." The man studied my face for a moment, not rudely, just carefully. Then he reached into his coat pocket again and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up briefly. My phone buzzed in my hand at the same moment. I looked down automatically. The message on my screen contained only 2 words. "Nice to meet you." For a moment, I just stood there under the building awning, the rain falling beyond the edge of the concrete like a silver curtain. My phone screen still glowed in my hand with the message he had just sent. "Nice to meet you." I slowly lifted my eyes from the screen and looked at him again. Up close, the calm in his expression felt even more unusual. Most strangers would look slightly awkward meeting someone in the middle of the night outside their apartment building. This man looked exactly as composed as if we were meeting for coffee at noon. "You are the one I texted," I said carefully. The man gave a small nod. "Yes." My voice came out more uncertain than I wanted. I thought it was the wrong number. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. It was. That answer confused me even more. "Then why are you here?" I asked. The rain tapped softly on the umbrella above his head while the engines of the SUVs continued humming behind him on the quiet Brooklyn street. "Because mistakes sometimes matter," he replied, "especially when they reach people who do not usually receive unexpected messages." I glanced past him at the row of vehicles and the men standing quietly nearby. The entire situation still felt unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life for a few minutes. "I did not mean to bother you," I said. "I can delete the message. It was just an argument with my boyfriend." His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened slightly at the word boyfriend. "That is not the problem," he said. I folded my arms instinctively against the cool air drifting through the rain. "Then what is?" For a moment he did not answer. Instead he looked past me toward the apartment building as if studying the structure. The old brick walls. The narrow windows. The crooked fire escape zigzagging down the side of the building. Finally he spoke again. "My phone number is not public information." I blinked at him. "Okay." That still did not explain anything. He continued calmly. "In fact, very few people in New York even know it exists." That made me laugh softly despite the tension in my chest. "Well, apparently I do now." "Yes," he said quietly. "And that is exactly why we are having this conversation." The street behind him remained completely still. No passing cars. No pedestrians rushing through the rain. Just the quiet motorcade of black SUVs waiting along the curb like patient shadows. My mind struggled to keep up with what he was saying. "Are you some kind of executive or something?" I asked. "A businessman maybe?" He studied my face for a second before answering. Something like that. That was not a real answer, and we both knew it. I looked down at my phone again. I still do not understand why this required 4 SUVs and half your staff. That time he did smile slightly. Old habits, he said. I exhaled slowly and leaned back against the cool brick wall beside the building entrance. The rain smelled faintly like wet pavement, and the bakery 2 blocks away that always started preparing bread around midnight. Look, I said, I really am sorry for the message. It was meant for someone else. I can promise you it will not happen again. For a moment, he simply watched me. His gaze was not threatening or aggressive, just thoughtful, like he was trying to decide something important. Then he nodded once. I believe you. Relief washed through me quickly. Good. Then this was all just a misunderstanding. I turned slightly toward the door behind me, ready to escape back inside my apartment and pretend this strange night had never happened. But before I could step away, his voice stopped me. Miss Carter. I looked back at him. Yes. His expression had shifted again, becoming more serious. The misunderstanding is not the message. It is what happened after the message. My stomach tightened slightly. What do you mean? Instead of answering immediately, he glanced toward one of the men standing near the nearest SUV. The man gave a subtle nod and held up a phone. The screen glowed faintly in the rain. The stranger in front of me turned his attention back to me. Your message was not only delivered to me, he said calmly. It was also noticed by someone else. A quiet chill moved through my chest despite the warm summer rain. Someone else? I repeated. He nodded once. Yes. And that someone now believes you may know something about me. I stared at him, completely lost. I do not know anything about you. That may be true, he said, but they do not know that yet. I felt the air shift the moment he said that. The rain was still falling softly around us. The same quiet Brooklyn street, the same row of black SUVs, but suddenly the night felt different. Like something invisible had just stepped into the conversation. I stared at him, trying to understand what he meant. They think I know something about you? I repeated slowly. Yes, he said. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, which somehow made the words feel heavier. I shook my head immediately. That does not make any sense. I sent one message by accident. That is all. I know, he replied. That is why I came personally. The way he said the word personally made me realize something. Someone like him clearly did not spend his nights driving through Brooklyn rain to explain misunderstandings. That meant the situation was serious in a way I still did not fully understand. My phone buzzed in my hand again. I glanced down automatically, but there was no new message. The screen had simply lit up from a notification earlier in the evening. For a moment, my reflection stared back at me in the dark glass. A tired bookstore clerk in a sweater and jeans standing outside her building at nearly midnight. Across from her stood a man with 4 SUVs and half a dozen silent guards waiting in the rain. The contrast would have been funny if it was not so strange. What exactly do they think I know? I asked quietly. The man stepped slightly closer, so the umbrella covered both of us from the rain. The motion was polite, almost considerate, but it made the conversation feel more serious. They believe that anyone who can reach my private number must have access to information that very few people possess, he said. I let out a small breath of disbelief. I barely have access to my own Wi-Fi half the time. He watched my expression carefully. I believe you. That is not the problem. Then what is the problem? I asked. He gestured slightly toward the dark street behind him. Information spreads quickly among certain people. Once a signal appears, they begin asking questions. I followed his glance toward the quiet line of SUVs and the empty road beyond them. The city felt strangely still, as if the rain had pushed everyone indoors. And what kind of questions are they asking? I said, the kind that lead to curiosity. Curiosity is rarely a peaceful emotion. I folded my arms again, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling forming in my chest. You are talking like this is some kind of spy movie. His expression remained calm. Real life is usually quieter than movies, but the consequences are often similar. I looked down the street again. A distant taxi passed at the far end of the block, its headlights briefly reflecting off the wet pavement before disappearing around the corner. Other than that, nothing moved. You said someone noticed the message, I said. How? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the man standing near the second SUV. The man lifted his phone again, as if confirming something silently. Then the stranger beside me spoke. Certain organizations monitor digital activity, related to people in my position. My eyebrows lifted. That sounds expensive. It is, he said simply. The rain continued falling steadily around the umbrella. Water dripped from the edges and splashed softly onto the sidewalk beside us. I took a slow breath and tried to process everything he had said. So let me understand this correctly. I accidentally texted your private number. Someone else saw that message appear somewhere in their system. And now they think I know secrets about you. That is correct, he said. And you came here tonight to explain that I do not. Yes. I stared at him for several seconds. That might be the strangest introduction I have ever had. His expression softened slightly. It is not my usual way of meeting people either. A small silence settled between us while the rain continued to fall and the engines of the SUVs hummed quietly behind him. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment I stepped outside. Who exactly are you? The man studied my face for a moment. Not suspiciously, just thoughtfully. Then he answered in the same calm voice he had used since the beginning of the conversation. My name is Adrian Russo. The name meant nothing to me at first. But something in the way the men around the vehicles straightened slightly when he said it told me it probably should. The name hung in the air between us for a moment while the rain continued falling softly against the umbrella. Adrian Russo. I repeated it silently in my mind, waiting for recognition that never came. If it was supposed to mean something, it did not mean anything to me. I tilted my head slightly and studied his face again. The calm posture, the quiet authority, the men standing nearby who watched him without obviously watching him. Clearly the name meant something to them. But to me it was just another name in a city of 8 million people. I gave a small, uncertain nod. Nice to meet you, Adrian Russo. Something in his expression shifted slightly when I said it like that. Not disappointment exactly. More like mild surprise. You have never heard my name before, he said. It was not a question. I shrugged lightly. Should I have? For the first time since the conversation began, he looked genuinely thoughtful. Around us the rain continued falling steadily, the drops tapping against the umbrella like a quiet clock marking the seconds of an unusual meeting. Behind him the SUVs remained lined along the curb, their headlights reflecting in the puddles on the asphalt. Finally he gave a small shake of his head. No, he said. That is probably a good thing. I crossed my arms again against the cool night air. Well, that is reassuring, because for a second I thought I was supposed to be impressed. One of the men standing near the vehicles shifted slightly, almost like he had heard something surprising. Adrian did not react. Instead, he watched me carefully, as if measuring my words and deciding what they meant. Most people react differently when they hear my name, he said. I raised an eyebrow. What do they usually do? He paused before answering. They become cautious. That answer made me smile faintly despite everything that had happened tonight. Maybe they just know you better than I do. The corner of his mouth moved slightly again, almost forming another smile, before fading back into the calm expression he seemed to carry naturally. That may be true, he admitted. The rain softened for a moment, turning from a steady curtain into lighter drops that whispered against the sidewalk. The quiet Brooklyn street still looked almost frozen in time. No passing cars. No late-night pedestrians. Just the two of us standing under an umbrella while several expensive vehicles waited patiently behind him. I shifted my weight slightly. So let me guess, I said. You are some kind of high-level executive with an extremely private phone number and very cautious security habits. Something like that, he said again. That was the second time he had used that exact phrase. Something like that. I noticed the way he avoided giving a direct answer without technically lying. That told me more about him than the words themselves. I looked down the street again. The distant bakery smell drifted through the damp air, warm and comforting in contrast to the strange tension of the night. I am still trying to understand why any of this matters, I said. If someone thinks I know secrets about you, you can simply tell them I do not. Adrian glanced briefly toward the man with the phone again before looking back at me. In some situations that would be enough. And this is not one of those situations. No, he said quietly. Because once curiosity begins it rarely stops immediately. I exhaled slowly. So what happens now? He studied my face again in that thoughtful way that made it feel like he was calculating several possibilities at once. Then he answered calmly. Now we make sure that no one bothers you while they learn the truth. I blinked at him. That sentence sounded reassuring and concerning at the same time. What does that mean exactly? Adrian turned slightly and gestured toward the vehicles waiting behind him. It means that for the moment you will not be staying here tonight. I stared at him, completely caught off guard. I am sorry, what? He spoke gently, as if explaining something simple. Just for a little while. Until certain misunderstandings settled down. I looked back at the familiar brick building behind me, then at the line of black SUVs glowing under the rain-soaked streetlights. You were suggesting that I leave my apartment in the middle of the night and get into one of those cars with a man I met 5 minutes ago. Adrian held my gaze calmly. When you say it like that, it does sound unusual. I laughed once under my breath. Unusual is one word for it. The rain began falling a little harder again, tapping faster against the umbrella above us. Adrian leaned slightly closer, so his voice carried clearly over the sound of the rain. Miss Carter, he said quietly, if you stay here tonight there is a chance someone else may arrive asking the same questions I did. I met his eyes, and they will not be as polite. For several seconds I did not say anything. The rain fell harder now, drumming steadily against the umbrella above us and splashing across the dark sidewalk. My apartment building stood behind me exactly the same as it had every night for the past 2 years. The crooked fire escape, the flickering hallway light on the second floor, the old brass number plate beside the door. Everything looked familiar, safe. But Adrian's last words echoed quietly in my mind. They will not be as polite. I shifted my weight and looked back toward the street again. The SUVs had not moved. The men near them remained calm and patient, their posture relaxed but alert in a way that suggested they were paying attention to everything around them. No one looked bored. No one looked nervous. They simply waited. I folded my arms against the cool, damp air. You are asking me to leave my home because someone might ask me questions about a message I sent by mistake. Adrian studied my expression carefully before answering. I am suggesting a temporary precaution. Temporary can mean a lot of different things, I said. His voice remained steady. In this case, it means until I am certain the situation has been clarified. I exhaled slowly. The rain smelled like wet asphalt and distant bread from the bakery down the block. Normally that smell meant comfort to me. Tonight, it only made the silence between us feel heavier. I glanced back toward the building entrance. My couch was upstairs. My takeout container was still sitting on the coffee table. My life was upstairs. A quiet, predictable life that had absolutely nothing to do with mysterious phone numbers or men arriving in motorcades. I turned back to Adrian. What if I say no? For the first time, he did not answer immediately. He looked toward the dark street for a moment before returning his attention to me. Then you would go upstairs and continue your evening exactly as you planned. That answer surprised me. You would just leave? I asked. If that is your decision, yes. I narrowed my eyes slightly. That seems very reasonable for someone who showed up with 4 SUVs. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly again. I prefer cooperation over persuasion. One of the men near the nearest vehicle shifted position slightly, scanning the street as a car passed at the far end of the block. The headlights briefly illuminated the rain before disappearing again. Adrian lowered the umbrella a little so the water ran off the edge toward the curb. Miss Carter, he said calmly, you are not obligated to trust me. In fact, it would be unusual if you did. I considered that for a moment. At least he was honest about that part. But you still believe someone else might come looking for me, I said. Yes, because they believe your message means something important. I laughed softly again, though there was no humor in the sound. That might be the most ridiculous misunderstanding in the history of text messages. He nodded slightly. Unfortunately, misunderstandings are rarely logical. The rain continued falling between us. I studied his face carefully now, looking for any sign that this entire situation was some kind of elaborate joke or strange coincidence. But there was nothing playful in his expression, nothing careless, just quiet certainty. My phone buzzed in my hand again. This time it was a real message. The screen lit up with a notification from an unknown number. Adrian's eyes moved briefly toward the glow of my screen. I looked down slowly. The message contained only one line. Is this Emily Carter? My stomach tightened immediately. That number was not Adrian's. It was different, completely unfamiliar. I lifted my eyes back to him. He had already seen my reaction. Another message appeared on the screen before I could respond. We have a few questions about a message you sent tonight. The rain continued falling around us, while the quiet Brooklyn street seemed to shrink into a much smaller world. Adrian watched my face calmly. They work faster than I expected, he said quietly. I swallowed and looked down at the glowing screen again. The typing dots from the unknown number appeared once more. Then another message arrived. We are very interested in who you were speaking with. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not move closer. He simply said one quiet sentence that suddenly made the decision feel very different. You may want to answer that question from somewhere else tonight. I stared at the glowing screen in my hand while the rain continued falling steadily around us. The new message from the unknown number sat there quietly, but it felt heavier than any message I had ever received. Is this Emily Carter? Then the second one beneath it. We have a few questions about a message you sent tonight. For a moment I did not move. My mind replayed the last 15 minutes again and again, trying to convince itself that this was still some kind of misunderstanding that would disappear if I ignored it. But the calm voice beside me broke that illusion gently. They found you quickly, Adrian said. I lifted my eyes toward him. How? He shrugged slightly beneath his coat. If they were already monitoring the signal that connected to my number, then it would not take long to identify the other device involved in the exchange. I looked back at my phone. That sounded less like a guess and more like a certainty. The typing dots appeared again on the screen from the unknown number. Then another message arrived. We would appreciate a quick reply. I felt a slow wave of unease rise in my chest. Whoever these people were, they clearly expected an answer. I turned the phone slightly so Adrian could see the screen. This is the first time something like this has ever happened to me, I said quietly. His expression remained calm. I know. I looked at him carefully. You seem very relaxed about the situation. That is because I have seen similar situations before, he replied. That answer did not make me feel better. I glanced toward the quiet street again. The rain had begun to slow slightly, turning into a steady mist that reflected the street lights and the headlights from the SUVs. The men near the vehicles still stood in their patient positions, occasionally glancing down the block as if they expected something to appear at any moment. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number appeared on the screen. If this number belongs to Emily Carter, please confirm. I swallowed slowly. They are very persistent, I said. Adrian nodded once. They will continue until they receive information. And if I ignore them? I asked. They will likely try another method. I looked back at him. Another method like what? He hesitated slightly before answering. They might try to speak with you in person. The quiet Brooklyn street suddenly felt a little smaller again. My apartment building behind me did not seem quite as comfortable as it had 15 minutes ago. I stared at the message on my phone again. The blinking typing dots appeared once more. Then another message arrived. We believe you contacted someone important earlier. Tonight, we would like to clarify the nature of that communication. I let out a slow breath. Important is one way to describe it, I said softly. Adrian watched my face carefully. The rain continued dripping from the edge of the umbrella between us. Finally, I looked up at him again. If I get into one of those cars, where exactly are we going? His answer came without hesitation. Somewhere quiet where this conversation can continue without interruption. That sounded suspiciously vague. I raised an eyebrow slightly. That is not a very comforting description. A faint smile appeared again. It is an honest one. I considered the line of SUVs again. Their dark windows reflected the streetlights like mirrors. Inside those vehicles was a world that clearly had nothing to do with my normal life. But the glowing screen in my hand reminded me that the quiet life upstairs might not feel so normal anymore either. My phone buzzed once more. A new message appeared. If you do not respond soon, we may come by to speak directly. I showed the message to Adrian. He read it calmly and nodded once. They are becoming impatient. I took a slow breath and looked down the street one more time. The rain mist drifted through the air while the quiet neighborhood slept around us, completely unaware that my life had just taken a strange turn because of one simple text message. Finally, I lifted my eyes to Adrian again. If I say yes to this temporary precaution, how long are we talking about? His voice remained steady. Long enough to make sure the wrong people lose interest in you. I glanced at the glowing message on my phone again. The typing dots had appeared for the fourth time. Then another line arrived. We are already in your neighborhood. My heartbeat slowed for a moment as I read those words. Then I slipped the phone into my pocket and looked at Adrian. Which car are we taking? For a moment Adrian did not answer my question. The rain continued falling lightly around us, turning the street into a quiet mirror of reflected headlights and yellow street lamps. My decision seemed to hang in the air between us. Then he nodded once, a small movement that immediately changed the posture of the men near the SUVs. The one standing closest to the first vehicle stepped. forward and opened the rear passenger door without a word. Adrian gestured toward it calmly. "This one," he said. I looked at the vehicle for a moment. Up close it looked even larger than it had from the sidewalk. The paint was so dark it reflected the rain like polished glass. The interior lights glowed softly through the open door, revealing a leather seat that probably cost more than everything in my apartment combined. I glanced back toward the entrance of my building. The familiar brick walls looked quiet and harmless, like they had always been. But my phone inside my pocket reminded me that the quiet was temporary. Somewhere nearby, another group of strangers believed I had information about the man standing beside me. That thought made the choice feel less dramatic and more practical. I stepped forward slowly and ducked into the vehicle. The warm interior air smelled faintly like leather and clean fabric. The seat was soft and wide, the kind of comfort designed for long drives rather than short city trips. Adrian closed the umbrella and followed me inside a second later. The door shut with a quiet, solid sound that immediately muted the noise of the rain outside. For the first time in several minutes, the night became silent. The driver glanced at Adrian in the rearview mirror. Adrian gave a small nod. The engine shifted smoothly as the SUV pulled away from the curb. Through the tinted window, I watched my apartment building slide slowly out of view. The crooked fire escape, the flickering hallway light, the small front steps where I had stood only minutes earlier trying to understand how a wrong text message had turned into this. The rest of the vehicles fell in line behind us as we moved down the street. The motion felt strangely calm. No rushing, no sudden acceleration. Just a quiet convoy moving through wet Brooklyn streets while most of the city slept. I sat back against the seat and looked at Adrian. "So this is the temporary precaution," I said. "Yes," he replied calmly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone again. The unknown number had sent another message while we were walking to the car. "We are close by." It said nothing else. Just that one sentence. I showed the screen to Adrian. His expression did not change. "They are trying to pressure you into responding quickly," he said. "It is a common tactic." I lowered the phone slowly. "I have to admit something," I said. "This is the strangest night of my life." Adrian leaned slightly back in his seat. "I believe you." Outside the window, the neighborhood continued passing quietly by. Small apartment buildings, closed grocery stores, a late-night pizza place glowing with fluorescent lights at the corner. The city looked normal, but I felt like I had stepped into a completely different version of it. One that existed quietly behind the scenes of everyday life. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked again. Adrian looked toward the road ahead before answering. "Somewhere comfortable where you can stay until things settle down." That sounded suspiciously like a hotel. "Your place or mine?" I asked lightly. The faint smile appeared again. "Mine will be easier to secure." I studied his face carefully. That sentence confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. Adrian Russo was not just some cautious businessman with private security. There was something larger about the way his world worked. Something organized and controlled. I glanced at the convoy following us in the side mirror. "How many people work for you?" I asked. "Enough to handle unexpected problems," he replied calmly. I leaned my head back against the seat and watched the rain streak across the dark glass. Somewhere behind us, another group of strangers was trying to locate the person who had texted Adrian Russo. And somehow that person was me. I looked down at my phone again. The screen lit up with another new message from the unknown number. "We would prefer to speak with you face to face." I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Adrian noticed the movement. "More messages?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slightly. "They will continue trying for a while." The city lights reflected in the rain outside while the SUV turned onto a wider avenue. Traffic here was lighter but still alive, with occasional taxis and delivery trucks moving through the late-night streets. I watched the buildings grow taller as we moved farther from my neighborhood. Finally, I looked back at Adrian again. "You know something funny?" I said. "What is that?" he asked. 6 hours ago, the most stressful thing in my life was an argument with my boyfriend over dinner. Adrian studied my face for a moment before replying quietly. "Life can change direction very quickly." The city changed slowly outside the window as we continued driving through the rain. The small neighborhood streets faded behind us and wider avenues took their place, lined with taller buildings and glowing storefronts that stayed open long after midnight. The windshield wipers moved in a steady rhythm while the convoy of black SUVs traveled smoothly through the late-night traffic. Inside the vehicle, everything remained calm and quiet. Almost too calm considering how strange the night had become. I rested my elbow lightly against the door and watched the reflections of streetlights slide across the glass like slow-moving stars. Adrian sat beside me with the same composed posture he had maintained since the moment we met. Nothing about him suggested urgency or stress, even though he had just taken a stranger away from her apartment because of a mistaken message. I glanced at him again. "You do this often?" I asked. "Rescue random people from confusing text messages." Adrian looked toward me with mild curiosity. "Not often." That answer sounded carefully chosen. "But it has happened before?" I pressed. He considered that for a moment. "Situations involving misunderstandings happen occasionally. Each one requires a different solution." The city lights brightened as we crossed into a busier district where tall office towers rose above the street like dark glass cliffs. Even at this hour, some windows were still glowing with late-night workers finishing their day. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone again. The unknown number had continued sending messages while we were driving. The newest one appeared only a minute ago. "We know you received our previous messages. Please confirm that you are safe." That wording made me pause. I turned the screen slightly toward Adrian. "This one sounds different," I said, less impatient. Adrian read the message quietly. "That is intentional," he replied. "When pressure does not work, they change tone." I tilted my head slightly. "You speak about them like you know exactly who they are." His gaze returned to the road ahead. "I have a good idea." That answer made me even more curious. "Are they criminals? Investigators? Something else?" Adrian gave a faint smile that suggested the question was complicated. In certain circles, the difference between those categories can become unclear. I laughed softly under my breath. "That is the most mysterious answer I have heard all night." The vehicle slowed slightly as we approached an intersection where traffic lights reflected across the wet pavement like colored paint. The convoy moved through the crossing smoothly before continuing down another wide avenue lined with expensive hotels and office buildings. My life normally did not pass through this part of the city at 1 a.m. The surroundings looked more like a scene from a movie than a normal Tuesday night. I leaned back into the seat again. "I keep thinking about something you said earlier." Adrian turned slightly toward me. "What is that?" "That people who hear your name usually react differently than I did." "Yes." I studied him for a moment. "What kind of reaction were you expecting?" Adrian watched the passing buildings through the window before answering. "Recognition." I thought about that. "Maybe fear?" I suggested lightly. "Something close to that." His calm honesty made the conversation strangely comfortable despite the situation. I looked down at my phone again. Another message had arrived from the unknown number while we were talking. "We are concerned that you may be receiving inaccurate information. Please respond when you can." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "They are getting creative." Adrian nodded. "They will continue adjusting their approach." I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket again. At this point, I feel like I should start charging them for conversation time. "That would certainly be unusual," he said. The SUV turned smoothly into a quieter street where the buildings were taller and more modern. A wide entrance appeared ahead, marked by polished stone walls and subtle lighting that illuminated the driveway. The lead vehicle slowed as the security gate opened automatically. I looked through the windshield. "This does not look like a hotel." Adrian answered calmly. "It is not." The vehicle rolled forward through the gate into a private courtyard surrounded by a sleek glass and steel tower that rose high above the street. The rain shimmered across the smooth stone ground while uniformed security staff stood beneath the covered entrance watching the convoy arrive. My eyes widened slightly. "You live here?" Adrian nodded once. "It is convenient." The SUVs came to a smooth stop beneath the entrance canopy where the rain could not reach us. One of the guards stepped forward immediately to open the door. I looked back toward the street we had just left. Somewhere out there, another group of people was trying to find Emily Carter, the woman who had accidentally texted Adrian Russo. I stepped out of the vehicle and looked up at the tall glass building above us. For someone whose life had been simple only a few hours ago, this night was turning into a very unexpected tour of a completely different world. The rain softened into a light mist as I stepped out of the SUV beneath the covered entrance of the tower. The air smelled cleaner here than it had in my neighborhood, less like old brick and damp sidewalks, and more like polished stone and city air after midnight. Two security staff members stood near the glass doors, both dressed in dark uniforms that looked more like those of a private hotel than a residential building. They nodded slightly when Adrian approached, not speaking, just acknowledging his presence the way people greet someone they are accustomed to seeing in charge. I glanced up again at the tower above us. The building rose high into the rainy sky, its glass walls reflecting the city lights in long vertical streaks. This place looked less like a home and more like the headquarters of a corporation. Adrian stepped beside me as the rest of the vehicles quietly parked along the entrance lane. "Welcome," he said calmly. I looked at him with a small skeptical smile. "You say that like this is a normal Tuesday night. For me it is unusual as well," he admitted. That answer surprised me enough to make me laugh softly. Good. I was beginning to feel like the only confused person in the city. The large glass doors slid open automatically as we approached, revealing a lobby that looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine. The ceiling rose at least 30 feet above polished marble floors that reflected soft golden lighting from long recessed panels overhead. A quiet fountain stood against one wall, the sound of water adding a calm rhythm to the otherwise silent space. My footsteps echoed lightly as I walked inside. "This is where you live," I said slowly. Adrian nodded once. "Yes." I turned in a slow circle, taking in the scale of the room. My entire apartment could probably fit into one corner of this lobby. "It is a little different from Brooklyn," I said. The faint smile appeared again. "That is a fair observation." One of the men who had been riding in the lead SUV approached Adrian quietly and spoke a few words in a low voice. Adrian listened briefly, then nodded once before the man stepped away again. I watched the exchange with growing curiosity. "Something tells me your life is more complicated than you described earlier." Adrian looked at me calmly. "It can be, yes." We crossed the lobby toward a bank of elevators framed by dark steel and glass. As we walked, I noticed something else unusual. There were security cameras placed discreetly in the corners of the ceiling, and 2 additional guards stood near a desk that looked more like a command station than a reception area. This building clearly did not rely on a simple doorman. The elevator doors opened before we even reached them. Inside, the walls were mirrored and softly lit, giving the small space a warm, quiet atmosphere compared to the vast lobby behind us. Adrian pressed a button near the top of the panel. The doors closed smoothly, and the elevator began rising almost silently. I leaned lightly against the railing and watched the city lights slide past the glass panels in the elevator shaft. New York looked very different from above in the rain. Thousands of lights glowing through mist and moving reflections across wet streets far below. My phone vibrated again in my pocket. I pulled it out slowly. The unknown number had sent another message. "We are still waiting for your response." I showed the screen to Adrian again. "They really do not give up easily." Adrian glanced at the message. "They will eventually realize that you are not responding tonight." "And then?" I asked. "Then their interest will begin to fade." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and watched the numbers on the elevator panel climb higher. 30 floors. 35. 40. My ears popped slightly from the change in pressure. Finally, the elevator slowed, and the doors opened onto a quiet private hallway with dark wooden floors and soft lighting along the walls. No other doors were visible except one large entrance at the far end. Adrian walked ahead, and the door unlocked automatically as we approached. The apartment beyond it felt less like a typical home and more like a modern penthouse overlooking the entire city. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a wide view of Manhattan glowing through the rain. The living space was large and open, filled with clean lines, dark wood furniture, and quiet warm lighting that made the entire room feel calm despite its size. I stepped inside slowly. "I think your living room might be larger than my entire building." Adrian closed the door behind us. "It is comfortable," he said simply. I walked closer to the windows and looked down at the city far below. The rain moved across the skyline like a silver veil, while traffic lights traced slow lines through the streets beneath the tower. Somewhere out there, another group of strangers was still looking for the woman who had sent a single accidental text message earlier that evening. I turned back toward Adrian. "So this is the temporary safe place?" "Yes." I studied the calm expression on his face again. "And you are certain they will not find me here tonight?" Adrian looked toward the dark city beyond the glass before answering quietly. "If they do, they will have a very difficult time getting past the front door." I stood quietly near the floor-to-ceiling window while the rain moved across the glass like soft silver lines. From this height the city looked almost peaceful. The streets far below were still alive with light, but the noise of traffic and voices had disappeared into a distant hum that barely reached the penthouse. For the first time since the night had begun, the tension in my shoulders eased slightly. Adrian walked across the room toward a low table and poured 2 glasses of water from a clear bottle resting beside a small tray. He handed one to me without saying anything. I accepted it and took a slow sip, realizing only then how dry my throat had become during the long series of conversations and decisions that had brought me here. "Thank you," I said quietly. He nodded once and stood beside the window, looking out over the city lights the same way I had been a moment earlier. For a while neither of us spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It felt like the kind of quiet that follows a long storm when everything finally pauses for a moment. My phone vibrated again in my pocket. I pulled it out. Slowly, already expecting another message from the unknown number. This time there were 3 waiting. The first one read, "We have been trying to reach you for some time." The second message followed a few minutes later. "If you are unable to speak freely, please confirm that you are safe." The third message was the most recent. "We would prefer to resolve this situation calmly." I stared at the screen for several seconds before lowering the phone again. Adrian noticed the movement immediately. "More messages?" he asked. "Yes. They sound concerned now." Adrian gave a small, thoughtful nod. "That means they are unsure about what has happened to you." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and leaned lightly against the window frame. I guess disappearing into a tower with a man they were trying to learn about was not part of their plan. "That is correct," Adrian said calmly. The rain continued sliding down the glass behind us while the skyline shimmered with thousands of distant lights. My mind replayed the entire night once more. The argument with my boyfriend at dinner. The careless text message. The quiet buzz of my phone on the couch. The line of black SUVs outside my building. Now I was standing 40 floors above the city inside the home of a man whose name apparently carried a kind of weight I had never even known existed. "Life can change direction very quickly," he had said earlier in the car. I understood what he meant now. I turned slightly to face him again. "So what happens tomorrow?" Adrian rested his glass on the table beside him before answering. "Tomorrow we learn whether their curiosity continues or fades." "And if it continues?" I asked. "Then we handle it." His answer was simple but confident in a way that suggested this was not unfamiliar territory for him. I walked a few steps farther into the living room, looking again at the quiet modern space around us. The furniture was arranged with careful precision. Everything looked calm, organized, controlled. It felt like the kind of place where nothing unexpected ever happened. I smiled slightly to myself. Tonight must be an exception. Adrian noticed the expression. "Something amusing?" he asked. I nodded once. "Just thinking about how strange the whole situation is. One accidental message and suddenly my life looks completely different for a while." Adrian studied me for a moment before replying. "Sometimes small moments open doors to very different worlds." I looked back at the rain moving across the windows and the city glowing beneath us. "Maybe," I said quietly. "Or maybe tomorrow everything goes back to normal and this becomes the strangest story I will ever tell." Adrian's gaze shifted back toward the skyline. "Perhaps," he said. My phone vibrated once more in my pocket. I pulled it out again and looked at the screen. A new message had arrived from the unknown number. It was shorter than the others. "We will speak again soon." I stared at the words for a moment before locking the screen. Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. "They are not giving up," I said. "No," he replied calmly. "People rarely give up when they believe something important has appeared in front of them." I slipped the phone onto the table beside the glass of water and looked back out across the city. Somewhere out there a group of strangers believed I knew something about Adrian Russo. And somewhere behind me stood the man whose name had quietly changed the direction of my entire night. For now the rain continued falling over New York, washing the streets clean while the city slept beneath us. But I had a feeling this story was only beginning.